Hello and welcome to the Kings Weekly Podcast, part of the Basketball Intelligence Podcast Network, the Believe Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I'm your co-host, Nick Agar Johnson, editor-in-chief of No Ceilings NBA and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick, and hello, everyone. Welcome.
So Ray had a special exercise that he wanted to run us through for this episode. We will do a brief recap and preview portion as always, but we're just past the quarter pole of the season at this point, and some things that were relatively clear to us and a number of other Kings fans and media and followers, etc., have now become abundantly clear, not just to the rest of the NBA, but to the Kings front office and ownership, who seem to be the last to get on board with where the situation was at. But Ray, why don't you run us through your thoughts on the Kings situation and, what happens next, essentially?
Thank you. I'll preface everything by saying that remind everybody just how brutal the Kings' schedule has been. We predicted they would be 5-13 after the first 18 games, in part because the schedule was so difficult, and they were. That turned out exactly as we predicted, and now they're getting screwed again by the fact that because of the Cup, the NBA Cup, two teams got added for everybody, and you couldn't have done much more difficult than the Kings had added to their already horrific opening schedule of having added Denver and Minnesota to the schedule. Thanks, scheduling gods. So anyway, that certainly affects things. But the take that I wanted to discuss is we, right before the season started, were saying the Kings, if they continue down the road that they're going down, it's hard to imagine that they can ever catch many, if actually any, of the young teams that are significantly better than them already in the Western Conference, which is mightily difficult.
Disastrous as always.
As always. And so we took the position, really it's time to rebuild, AKA blow it up. A lot of people agreed with us and a lot of people disagreed with us about that. And what I've been thinking about is, what were the Kings management thinking at the time? And I've come up with the four most likely scenarios in my view. The first one was, hey, we've got a competitive team. Let's just stick with it. I would characterize that as beyond delusional. Second one was, hey, miracles happen. 2 years ago,
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
Although one of the teams in the league had 579 missed games to injury, Kings had 65. And maybe that'll happen again. And maybe every other team is going to have in the hundreds and multi-hundreds. Pretty unrealistic, but possibly that's what they were thinking. Third one was, yeah, it's really clear we need to rebuild this team and start over again. And one of the things that kind of adds to that is what a good job they did in the draft. So maybe they are thinking that, right? But for this version, this version number 3, it's perhaps they were thinking, we don't need to blow it up right now. In fact, we're going to be better off if we play things out, because the closer we get to things like trade deadline, the more teams are going to self-identify as being desperate and being one player away from being a serious contender. And yeah, we'll overpay to get that one player that would fit perfectly the one thing we're missing. So that was the third one. And the fourth one that I came up with was, let's just blow it up now. It's like as we've heard on King's Weekly podcast, we need to do this right now, and there's no reason to dilly-dally. Let's just start the process. So those were my takes on what their takes might have been, and I'm not going to try to mind read as to exactly what they were thinking about and what they were trying to do, and you can all come to our own conclusions based on how things have played out. But to me, those were the things that were possible in terms of what they were thinking.
Well, given that our episode about the Keon Ellis Minutes game is still our most popular episode of the Kings Weekly podcast that we've ever produced, maybe we should try and get in the mind of these guys. People seem to like that part. But we were talking about this concept before we started recording, and my immediate reaction was sort of twofold of I think that number 3 is the most likely, and also I hope it was number 3 because however delusional the front office and ownership may or may not be, number 3, it's not an idea of the team that I would have agreed with heading into this season. I would have thought that there was a bit more of a reason to try and blow things up sooner rather than sort of waiting. But I could understand the logic of, DeMar DeRozan in particular, because his contract is a lot less onerous than Zach LaVine's. Like DeMar DeRozan in particular, I was thinking, hey, there may be a few teams that really want a very consistent scorer who offensively at least plays well with others. Defensively, you can argue about, but someone who even as recently as last year was one of the best fourth quarter scorers in the league, who has this incredibly long track record of success, who if you're a team that doesn't really have anybody that operates in the mid-range, that's an opening that DeMar DeRozan can and will take advantage of. And so, if the thought process going into the season was, hey, even if we are not quite as good as we think we're going to be, and hopefully someone in the Kings front office was looking at the schedule in addition to us to figure out how disastrous the month of November was going to be for the team. If they had headed into the season with the thought process of, this, the next successful version of the Kings team probably does not have many of the players that are on the current roster of the Sacramento Kings on that next good version of the Kings, right? So with that in mind, if their conception going into the year was, we're probably not going to be great, but someone's going to buy in on DeMar DeRozan, and maybe someone's even going to buy in on Zach LaVine if we get the right team and they're desperate enough. Here's the thing. After the first 5 games or so, it became pretty clear that not only was this not going to work, but that the longer this dragged out, everybody involved was going to look worse for it, right? Like, DeMar DeRozan is not increasing his value this season. Zach LaVine is extremely not increasing his value this season. And so continuing to hold off until the trade deadline leads to infuriating things like Nick Clifford being sent down to the Stockton Kings. And thankfully, he's already been recalled. But, you have 2 players ahead of Nick Clifford who everybody at this point knows will not be on the next good version of the Kings, and Nick Clifford might be. And it's something that you emphasized more in the past than I did, and I've 100% come around to your way of thinking on this, is Keegan Murray is not going to have the ball in his hands enough to develop his offensive game if the ball is always in the hands of DeMar DeRozan or Zach LaVine or Russell Westbrook. And Westbrook has been much, much better than I feared he would be heading into the year. And that's almost entirely counteracted by the fact that Dennis Schroeder has been much, much worse than I expected him to be heading into the year. And where you end up with it is the clear best player for the Kings this season is 37 years old and was signed at a training camp, right? Like that's not
and no other team wanted him.
Yeah, that's not a sustainable long-term plan, right? And so once we get to the point where, as this situation gets worse, both in terms of on court and in terms of some of the things these players are saying off the court, like the Zach LaVine interviews post Miami game were not encouraging. If you are thinking that, hey, maybe a 42-point game can help Zach LaVine rebuild his value around the league, I don't think anyone who listened to the interviews are particularly feeling bullish on trading for Zach LaVine at this point. It's like, at this point, both DeRozan and Levine are essentially sunk costs of like, hey, if you can, it's not even to the point where if you can get anything positive for them anymore, right? It's like, I think that at this point, and I'm much more certain about this with Levine than DeRozan. I'm much more certain that no one will trade for Levine, and maybe someone will trade for DeRozan, though that's looking like a fainter and fainter possibility. But either way, at this point, every minute and every shot that you're giving to Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan is a look that is not being taken by Keegan Murray or Neat Clifford or Maxime Reynaud or, in theory, Keon Ellis, although at this point it seems like he's just not going to play no matter what the situation is, which I think everybody who's listened to the podcast more than once knows our thoughts on the Keon Ellis situation.
Well, in part because it's everybody else in the world's thought except the people that are running the Kings.
Which unfortunately is starting to develop into a little bit of a pattern. But yeah, I mean, at this point, it's like everybody in the basketball world knows that the Kings should try and, trade everything that's not nailed down for parts. But I'm hoping that a lot of the, public discussions that we're hearing of the public negotiations around Jonathan Kuminga for Malik Monk, like, trading Malik Monk never particularly made sense to me. Trading him for someone in Kuminga who I don't see where he helps the Kings.
How's this phrase? Trade for someone who can't even play for Steve Kerr?
Well, I mean, given Vivek's predilections around Steve Kerr, I'd be stunned that he would ever trade for somebody that was in Steve Kerr's doghouse.
Hard to imagine. And I guess I would add a 4.5 maybe to the list, which is what I called, and I had a variety of S words that I used with you, one of which was surreptitious. Maybe they're doing a surreptitious tank. Maybe they're decided, let's not play Keon Ellis.
It ain't surreptitious anymore.
No, but starting out, it's like,
sure.
We'll do certain things that are going to make the team worse, and it won't look the same as sitting Walker Kessler, right? And maybe sitting players who are healthy, and obviously it is what they did with Keon. But some of the other things, let's try to nibble around the edges of bad things that we can do that don't really look like we've folded up our tent. And some people call that an ethical tank. I call that like a surreptitious tank. Maybe that's what they were doing. I don't know. And I guess one other thing we should mention probably is, much as we really like and admire Doug Christie, he's really in over his head. No fault of his. Hired under bizarre circumstances with very little experience, only experience as an assistant coach for a very short period of time. And typically, that's not the type of hire that succeeds. And it really means, am I going to outcoach Eric Spoelstra? Am I going to outcoach Rick Carlisle? And I could go on with a list. It's just not going to happen. And that's another factor.
I mean, he was put in a weird situation twice, right? It wasn't just once. It was first the interim tag last year, and then the Kings, hire a new head of the front office, and almost always what that means is that person hires their own coach. And instead it's just, no, I guess we're retaining him in this weird sort of lame duck thing where like we don't know if he's, actually going to be the coach for longer than this coming season. But, it's just a weird situation all the way around. And, you mentioned, he only had the, couple of years of prior assistant coaching. It was also, he only had a couple of years of prior assistant coaching with the Kings, right? He's only familiar with the one organization. And to me, that's telling too, not just in the sense of, the classic sort of statement when Vlade was the GM of the Kings was, who else would hire this guy to be in this position other than the Kings? And Doug Christie, it's a very similar thing. And,
but at least they knew they could get Marvin Bagley that way.
Oh God. Anyway, no, but with the Christie situation, it's a similar deal of, much though I think there are genuine things that he has success with as a coach. The player ego management deal, the relating to the players as someone who did have a long and successful NBA career, right? Like all of those things, were and are true. And I think given there's sort of the fired coach bounce that many teams have, that the Kings didn't a short winning streak after I think they lost the first. I know they lost his first game, and then from there they did much better. But either way, the point being, especially in the start of his tenure last year, clearly he was reaching the players in a way that Mike Brown was not, and that's why the team was better after Doug Christie became head coach. But in year two, it just doesn't seem like he's figured out some of the more complicated nuances of coaching that, and this is something you and I have talked about as well, but sometimes a player goes directly from media to coaching and they're JJ Redick. And sometimes a guy goes directly from media to coaching and they're Doug Christie. And it's like you don't necessarily know until you've got some time under your belt as a coach, but now that we're this deep into year two and the rotations are still confounding, and for all of his well-deserved defensive reputation, this team is still bottom 5 in defensive rating, right? Like, and for
they still don't guard the 3-point line.
Yeah, and for the benefits of being a coach who was a player, it sure doesn't seem like he's gotten that defensive buy-in from the guys who are supposed to be the leaders on the team.
True. Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because he's very likable and he's very smart, and he has, in general, what seems to be the respect of the team, and they like him and they like playing for him and they're willing to play for him. On the other hand, he gets out-coached almost every game, and that's not necessarily true 5 years from now. He might be the best coach in the league 5 years from now. But right now, most people who'd would have been thrown into the situation he was in would probably be succeeding at about the same rate that he's succeeding.
Yeah, I mean, it was a disaster from the start, and the fact that he had a winning record last year is a testament to him. The fact that the team's been as god awful as they've been this year, at least some of the blame has to go on him,
Sure.
right? It's like the flip side of the argument for, hey, he deserves credit for, it's not like they turned around their season with him as head coach, right? But they had a winning record after not
27 and 24, something like that.
I believe so. Yeah. In fact, doing the quick math, that's pretty much what it has to be, because I know Mike Brown was 13 and 18 when he got fired. So, 13 plus X equals 40.
But remember, he won something like 9 out of his first 10 or something. So 27 and 24 is not.
Right. Well, that was the thing I was saying before, of he did lose his first game, but after that, there seemed to be the fired coach bounce that many teams experience. But I mean, even if you discount, let's call it the first 5 games, right? That's still essentially a 500 record when Mike Brown was significantly below that.
Yeah.
Decent job with a team that was pretty middling, but now the team is not very much different, but clearly and obviously worse. And the adjustments that need to be made are not being made. And it's nowhere near as bad as it was in the Luke Walton era, where the Kings were consistently 30th in third quarter point differential, in addition to being 30th in defense every year. But, saying that Doug Christie is not as bad as Luke Walton is like saying that dying from a bullet to the brain is better than crucifixion. It's like, it's still not good. It's still not something you want.
One of the strange things about it was that one of the things that you could point to that made the team better was obviously playing Keon. And his reward for that, or the reaction to that, is to bury him again this year. That makes no sense, but we beat that well past to death.
Yeah, but, again, that sort of goes back to the point I was making earlier of there's a sunk cost fallacy permeating the situation, right? Like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the Kings front office received calls from every single one of the other 29 teams that said, we are not trading for Zach LaVine or DeMar DeRozan, no matter what you say. At that point, and I'm asking you this as a question because I have a pretty strong opinion, but at that point, is it better to just tell Zach LaVine to go home? Because I think it is.
Oh,
I
I,
think it is because the team is already, one of the three worst teams in the league. And every minute that Zach LaVine doesn't play is a minute that either Neat Clifford or Keon Ellis is playing, presumably. At which point, again, it's not like the Kings' record is going to get significantly worse. They're 6-18. They're tied for the third worst record in the league. Like,
I would
it's
have
not.
said I said no because I was thinking reputationally with
Sure,
other
sure.
players, and other players don't like that.
And that's
And
completely fair. I just mean purely from the perspective of, are the Kings better off if Zach LaVine does not play?
they're
And
certainly better off in the sense of developing young players. And
right.
you mentioned Keegan earlier. We've talked about that a lot, and it's not just Keegan by a long shot.
Yeah.
But he was so restricted last year in terms of what his role was. He still defended and rebounded really well, but his offense was, not there. I would argue in large part, yes, it was part because of coming back from injury, but also because of the role of some of the other players. The one thing you haven't discussed, and maybe we don't have a lot of time to go into it now, is Sabonis.
Mm.
So interested in what you
Yeah.
say about him. Now
I'm
he's in his 20s, still about to turn 30, I guess, and so there's some difference, and I don't know how that plays out really, and maybe it
I'm
depends on the size of the offer you get for him.
yeah, I'm torn. And the main reason I'm torn is because he was so clearly playing through injury earlier this season. And so when a player, it's funny because I actually just was talking about this on the deep dives episode that I did with Paige Otto for No Ceilings yesterday, of watching all of UCLA guard Donovan Dent's 3-point attempts this season. And after the first two clips, I was like, okay, what is he playing through? Because clearly it's something. And I looked it up and it was a left calf strain. It was like, okay, so given that it's a left calf strain and the vast majority of his jump shots are going long and to the right, that seems like a pretty obvious case of overcompensation to me, right? But, he's still playing in the games. And so the fact that his, shooting splits show up as 36 from the floor and 7 from 3-point range, if all you're looking at is the numbers, then it's like, wow, he's, severely fallen off. What is going on? And, part of that is small sample size, obviously. But with Sabonis in particular, it's like, yeah, okay, he's shooting worse and he's, not passing as well. And, his offensive game looks a lot less potent, but, he's playing through an injury. It's pretty clear that he's not himself. And so I don't know what the situation is with Sabonis in the sense of, maybe he comes back from his injury and he's his old all-star borderline all NBA self and it's not a problem. I don't know the answer to that. I'm pretty confident on the answer with Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan.
Well, maybe the answer for Sabonis is he adds a lot to the team. He obviously has some very significantly pronounced weaknesses. He's a very valuable member of the team, and maybe he's worth keeping around for those reasons, but with the understanding, at least in the back of your mind, that if and when you ever really do put together the team that's going to be a contending team, it's not going to be around him.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the flip side of, I don't think he's the best player on a top tier playoff team. I think that with the right pieces around him, he can absolutely be the second or third best guy. But the problem is, one of the major things that he needs is 3-point shooters to kick out to, and the Kings are dead last in 3-point makes this season.
Yeah.
Like even though I completely agree and acknowledge that he is a very specific kind of player who needs a very specific kind of skill set around him to work, right? And that skill set is very, very difficult because every NBA team wants a stretch four who can shoot threes and also, be the LeBron James Miami 2020 to 2012 version defensively of just slides over and covers everybody. And, anybody from the quickest point guards to, the bulkiest power forwards are shut down by, like, everybody's looking for Chet Holmgren, right? It's not There's a reason that Chet Holmgren got the max deal despite scoring 15 points a game. It's because he does absolutely everything else that you would want of a player of his archetype. And so, yeah, if Sabonis were still on the Thunder, it would make a ton of sense because he would have a ton of shooters to kick out to, and he would be covered for defensively. It's not just that he was playing through injury; it's that there couldn't possibly be a worse roster construction around him than the team that is literally dead last in 3-point makes. I cannot emphasize that enough. They're worse than Orlando this year.
So that does say a lot.
Shall we move on to the recap preview portion?
Good.
Let's do it. So the first game in the recap preview portion was the game that happened the evening that our previous episode went up, the brutal blowout loss to the Houston Rockets, which there's only really one particular thing I have to say about that game, which was this was the Maxime Reynaud show. And granted, part of that was because this game was well over, by the time he was getting most of his minutes in the second half and, most of the touches he was getting in the second half. But, 25 points, 6 assists, 25 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists, a steal and a block, perfect from the free throw line, perfect from 3-point range, showed a lot of what he can do in terms of his in-between game, in terms of his finishing around the rim. And also, something that has been clear as he's, had his semi-breakout, the last few games is something that you and I talked about after watching him in Summer League, which is, man, for the concerns that are quite valid about his defense, he communicates at an exceptionally high level for any player, much less a rookie big man.
Astonishingly so. And you're right. At Summer League, that was the very first thing we noticed. And it was the very first thing we exchanged a conversation about, wow, this is amazing. And the fact that, and that's carried over into the regular season, the fact that experienced players have spotted it as well and appreciate it and are very happy to defer to him. That, most situations, if you heard, hey, there's a rookie on a team that's speaking up and trying to direct the defense and stuff, oh, can you imagine the crap he's going to be taking from the veterans on the team? Not so with him. They love it and they appreciate it, and it's really working for him. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, again, even the constant conversation that we have, that we on the No Ceilings side, and also conversations I have with you about how difficult it is for a rookie to be a contributor on the defensive end. It's early and it's not always the best measure of individual player success, but it does say something quite interesting to me that the Kings defensive rating is better with Maxime Reynaud on the floor than it is with him off the floor.
No doubt. And just the fact that he's doing other things far better than most people anticipated. It's, we've always been on his bandwagon before there was a Reynaud bandwagon. So it's great to see the development he has had now, obviously helped by the fact that Sabonis has been injured and all that, but very, very significant contribution and on the development arc.
And that's something I'm curious about because, his volume has been very minimal this year, but, he has the potential to stretch the floor in a way that, Sabonis, genuinely to his credit, has tried to incorporate that into his game many times over the years. And, I think part of that as well is that his rookie year in Indiana, he was essentially relegated to being a floor spacer, and that wasn't his game. But, he's tried to incorporate that over the years. And, last year was his greatest 3-point volume since his second All-Star season in Indiana. And, we hit him at a 42% clip, right? But ultimately, and this is something that, is also something I talk about quite a lot on the scouting side of things of, remember the year that Rajon Rondo was a member of the Kings and he shot 37% from 3-point range? And the reason he shot 37% from 3-point range is because he took like 1.5 of them per game. And every single one of them, there wasn't anybody within 10 feet of him. Like, volume is a significant part of the 3-point math. And I would 9 times out of 10 rather have someone who shoots 33% from 3 on 5 attempts per game, especially as a big, than, 38% on 2 attempts per game. Because if you're doing the Rajon Rondo thing, defenses don't care. They're not bending to try and make sure you're involved in the coverage. Whereas, if you're taking 5 of them a game, once you catch the ball beyond the arc, the other team, even if it's only a perfunctory contest, they at least have to pretend to care about the fact that you're out there in a way that means someone has to shift over to cover you, which means if you can pass, which is something that Reyno is solid at, obviously nowhere near as good as Sabonis, but he's not a black hole offensively in the way that many young big men are. You can create around that, and it's interesting to me because in theory, the version of Reyno that continues to up his 3-point volume, not defensively, but offensively, is an excellent complement to Sabonis, especially since, the second thing that we pointed out about Reyno, which is also something I discussed with Nathan Gribble over at No Ceilings, is his handle looks so much better in person than it does on film. And that's something where, for as good as Sabonis is, he's not someone who's going to take anybody off the dribble, right? And so the offensive toolkit that Reyno has, in theory, is a great complement for Sabonis. Now, the defense is, a different matter entirely, but I would be curious to see if, when Sabonis returns, if the Kings try and run both of them out there more often, because that could be it's going to be a disaster defensively, but it could be like we score 140 and give up 130 kind of lineup, in a way that, for all that we score 130 and give up, score 140 and give up 130, that's certainly a lot better than the Kings are doing right now when they're scoring 110 and giving up 120, right? Like,
what's interesting to me about that, that's a conversation we had right after we saw him in Summer League.
Yeah. And it's a conversation that I'd still like to have because I'd like to see the Kings do it more.
Yeah.
So that's the Houston game, which, again, really entirely settles around Reyno. And then the next game was the Kings breaking their 4-game losing streak by pretty handily defeating the Miami Heat. But admittedly, you have more to say about that game than I do, so I'm going to give you the floor.
Well, to me, it illustrated that the Kings have found a recipe for winning games. And here's what that recipe is. They should play teams that are on the second night of a back-to-back, played on the road the night before, went down to the wire, and have it be in the small single digits of what happened in the night before so that they wore themselves out, and were missing 2 of their best players, including their best defenders, and a third player who was a significant role player. If they can find teams to play that fit all of those characteristics, played the night before, went down to the wire, had to travel to get back to their home arena early the next morning, and were missing 2.5 key players, they're going to win most, if not all, of those games. And that was exactly the same thing that happened in the Denver game, where Gordon and Brown didn't play as well as Strother. And in the Miami game, all those other factors present, and Hero and Davion Mitchell, if we remember him, didn't play along with Pell Larson. So to me, wow, I wanted to watch that game. Oh my God, didn't I just see this game?
That's a lot of caveats. Unfortunately, those caveats are necessary. Yeah, I mean, look, and we talked about this before we started recording, and the one thing that I pointed out was, for all of those similarities that are very telling in how many of them you had to list and how many of them it took, Miami has a much better bench. And, the fact that Jaime Jaquez went for 27, 6, and 6 in this game is kind of indicative of the fact that Miami can weather those injuries a bit better than most teams. And, also, this is asinine to say, but the Denver game was a 5-point margin. This game was a 16-point margin, and it was over by halftime, right? This was the only double-digit win the Kings have had this season. It more than, let me just triple check my math to make sure. Yeah, it more than tripled their previous greatest margin of victory for the season. So as many caveats as you had to give, which all are fair caveats to give in this situation, it was at least nice to have one game where, it was pretty clearly going to be a Kings win where, again, even though Miami actually managed to outscore the Kings after halftime, they still managed to win by 16 points. It is nice to have a blowout win because literally this is the first time it's happened all season.
Sure.
So the final game in the recap portion that we have to cover was the Kings loss to the Pacers. And this game resulted in them having identical 6-18 records at the conclusion. But as you and I talked about last week in the preview portion of this game, the Indiana Pacers of right now are not the same Indiana Pacers that started the year 4-18. And, really they started the year 2-16. They've been 4-2 since then. And do I think that they're going to finish the season above 500? No. But are they a much better 6-18 team that has been much harder hit by injuries than the Kings have been this season? Yes. I think that's objectively the case.
Yeah, they're the Memphis Grizzlies of this season in terms of recent year histories. And, it started, of course, with Halliburton. And it seemed like just about everybody else since then. And now they're significantly reconstituted. He's obviously not coming back for the season. But, as they get the players trickling back into the lineup, they're clearly playing better, and they're clearly going to play much better.
So, I mean, this team made the finals last year for a reason. They took the Thunder to Game 7 for a reason, right? Like, they're an incredibly good basketball team that has just had no chance because everybody's been hurt. It's
been amazing, yeah.
The fact that they started the year 2-16 is staggering, but it was clear even as that was happening that was absolutely no indictment of the players on the roster, that they were playing with a bunch of G League guys. I mean, other than Pascal Siakam, second place guy in minutes on the team right now is Jarris Walker. That was not their plan heading into the season.
That's pretty remarkable, and the results speak for themselves.
Yeah. I mean, Jay Huff, who, I'm pretty sure we talked about him last week as well, as how we couldn't comprehend why nobody seems to want this guy, and he keeps bouncing around and doing a really good job in limited minutes and then bouncing around somewhere else. But Jay Huff was, essentially signed off the scrap heap, and he's just barely behind Isaiah Jackson for fifth on the team in minutes. And Isaiah Jackson is fifth on the team in minutes.
And isn't Jay Huff leading the league in block shots, even though he's playing about 22 minutes a game?
He is, which is
unconscionable.
How
can that possibly be true?
I mean, it can be true because Victor Wembanyama's not playing. But
that's
beyond that, yes.
But there are other good shot blockers in the league who are playing many minutes more than he is.
Yeah, well, he's a big boy. That does help with the whole shot blocking thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this Indiana team was, again, the fact that the Indiana win and the Sacramento loss meant that they exited this game with identical records says absolutely nothing about the state of these two teams and the direction they're going both this season and beyond this season. So, even though the Pacers started the game with a worse record, this was not the most surprising loss, especially, after the high of blowing out that thoroughly destroyed Miami team in the game before.
Yeah.
So now, before we wrap things up, let's just quickly get to the preview portion. And we've mentioned it before. We will mention it again. In fact, we will mention it again right now. The Kings got very, very unlucky with their in-season tournament makeup games, as it were. So the game tonight, as you are listening to this, against the Denver Nuggets, and then the other replacement game is at Minnesota on December 14th. And the good news is that those are two of the teams that the Kings have beaten this year. So, there is that element to this, which is nice. And hey, they had them as back-to-back games last time around, and they won against Denver and won against Minnesota for their longest winning streak of the season, aka their only winning streak of the season longer than one game. But, if they could repeat that in these in-season tournament games, that would certainly be a plus. But yeah, I mean, for all that we talked about the November schedule, part of the concern was that they played each of these teams multiple times, and for them to be playing both of these teams yet again, it's just they've had the most hideous schedule luck even heading into the year, and the part of the schedule that was unknown also broke against them, which is not what you want to see.
So I have good news and bad news about the schedule. The good news, there is a part of the schedule coming up that has a 6 games as follows in this order: the Wizards, the Grizzlies, the Clippers, the Cavs, the Pelicans, and the Jazz. The bad news is it starts February 1st.
Yeah, this team is going to have a decent number of losses greater than 18 by the time we reach that point.
Yeah.
If I'll put it this way, if the Kings somehow only have 18 losses by the time we get to February 1st, then please feel free to @ me on every social media platform until the end of time. I will be taking the entirety of every monetary influence that I have and spending it on lottery tickets if the Kings manage to pull anything close to that off. I mean, look, this team has a winning percentage of 250 right now. They've won 6 of their 24 games, and as you mentioned, there is a light little 6-game portion of the schedule. First of all, that's less than half of the 13-game schedule disaster that they had in November. But also, like, by the time we get to February 1st, if anyone on this team is going to be tradable, that's right about when they're going to get moved too. So, I almost hope that this team looks dramatically different by the time we reach February 1st, because it will mean that they've found buyers for some of the players who I'm starting to become, well, not starting to, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic about the Kings' abilities to move them in trades.
Yeah, I feel the same way, except I wouldn't put an almost in there.
Fair. Very fair. The final 2 games that we have in the preview portion, the Kings have a home and away against Portland. So they are playing at Portland on December 18th, a week from today when this episode airs, and then home against Portland on December 20th. And Portland is a very interesting team for a number of reasons, but beyond sort of the off-court stuff with Portland, this is a team that I think, especially given how they closed last year, I might have expected to have a slightly stronger start than they've had this year. But even without that, first of all, they are even more injured than Indiana right now, which says quite a lot. But, even beyond that, it's not just that this team is exceptionally young. Like, the only players who get significant minutes who are over the age of 25 are Robert Williams, Dwop Reith, Jeremy Grant, and Drew Holiday. And given how Jeremy Grant's been playing lately, that's not a problem at all. But this is a team that, clearly, even though the start to this season, both on and off the court, has not been what they might have hoped for, they've got a really bright future ahead of them. And it's not just that they've got good young players, it's they've got good young players across the positional spectrum, and they all play well together. So it'll be interesting to see what that home and away looks like. I mean, Portland is ahead of the Kings in the standings right now, obviously, but given what this team has and how hurt they've been all year, I would not be surprised at all if this year ends similarly to last year for them, when they started last year 13-28 and then, closed the season with what was the run? It was 28-18, I think, was the run of that math is wrong. Either way, the point being, they were a well above 23-18. That's what it was. Well above 500 team for the second half of the season. Given how injury plagued they've been this year and development for all of their exceptionally young roster, I would expect them to be better the second half of the year than they were the first half. And we'll see how much of that comes to bear against the Kings, especially given that a few of the players who are technically on the injured list for them right now have day-to-day injuries that presumably will not keep them out for the 2 Kings games a week from now.
I have very positive feelings about how they're doing things, and there's always the requisite that's critical, which is called patience. If they exhibit that, I think they are doing a really good job of building, and these things take time.
Well, these things take time has been a no ceilings catchphrase for years, so I don't think we can end on a better note than that. But just in case, is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap this one up?
That's it for me.
All right, so then that will do it for us. He is Ray LeBove. You can find him on social media at Ray LeBove. You can find me on social media at NBA Johnson, and you can find us, Kings Weekly Podcast, at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, at Kings Weekly Podcast on Blue Sky, and in theory, either soon or now on YouTube as well, Kings Weekly Podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please take the time to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a rating and or a review as well. 5 stars always much appreciated on our end. As mentioned up top, we are part of the Basketball Intelligence Podcast Network. We are also now part of the Believe Network. For those of you not in the know, that's BLEAV Network. So check them out as well. We're also part of the Old Man Squad Network, as previously mentioned. And again, we will have an episode, as always, for you next week. So be on the lookout for that one. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.